When looking at an ecosystem, we're focusing on two main components. We are focusing on the abiotic components, A meaning non, bio again meaning living. So the non-living things and their interaction or relationship with the bio, biotic things. And when we're looking at an ecosystem, we're talking about those interactions between living and non-living, abiotic and biotic, in a defined area. So when we're looking at biotic factors, we're talking about animals like you and I, bacteria, humans like you and I, plants, as well as other unicellular or colonial living organisms. When we're looking at biotic factors, meaning without life, abiotic, without life, we're talking about water, rocks, wind, temperature, and then other things like volcanoes, hurricanes. The ingredients for life really depend on molecules. When we are looking at life, life requires certain things. They need energy. Anything living needs energy. And when we're talking about the energy part of a molecule, we're talking about the things that are circled here in green, or the bonds. So the bonds between the atoms of a molecule or a compound, that holds the energy. The chemicals, those are what we would refer to as the nutrients. And those are the building blocks. So the hydrogens, the nitrogens, the carbons, other parts of a molecular compound, those are all of the nutrients. Where do we get these parts, the bonds? That energy ultimately on Earth comes from the sun. There are other ways that we can get energy, but for our simple purposes in this class, we're going to talk about energy mainly coming from the sun. So that energy, once it gets used, you can't have it back again. You need to replace it. The nutrients, when the energy is utilized, you're left with these hydrogens, nitrogens, carbons, oxygens. They can go into places like the air, the soil, and they can get taken in by a living thing and reused again. And so one of the things that we find when we're talking about energy and nutrients, there's a big difference, and oftentimes we use them interchangeably in everyday life, but that's incorrect. That energy moves one way through the system, that it gets used and it needs to be replaced. Whereas when we're talking about nutrients, nutrients get recycled throughout. So one of the things about energy is that we have to focus on the laws of thermodynamics, and there's two laws of thermodynamics. And the first law of thermodynamics says that energy is not created nor destroyed, but it is utilized. And the second law of thermodynamics, what it states that as energy gets converted from one form into another, the amount of usable energy decreases constantly because a lot of that usable energy gets lost as heat. And that's part of the equation of changing energy from one form into another, is that you lose energy as heat. Nutrients, they never leave the system. So the carbons, the hydrogens, the nitrogens, those go into places again, like air, ground, and then they are taken up again and reused, but then you have to replace the bonds or the energy that holds them together in molecules and compounds. So nutrients are always used, but then they are used again, used again, used again, and we call that recycled, true recycling through the abiotic into the biotic, back to the abiotic, into the biotic, and recycled. So used and recycled. The flow of energy, again, we're going to just say for our purposes, the main source of energy on the Earth is energy comes from the sun. It reaches the Earth in places like heat, light, electromagnetic waves. The main way that energy is captured and utilized is through the process of photosynthesis. And so we can see here that energy brought in by, we'll name these in a little bit, the producers, They can utilize light, carbon dioxide, and water, and they can create bonds between the nutrients that they're taking up. It gets passed on through organisms in the ecosystem in a couple of different ways. But one of the things that I want you to notice is that when we're talking about the energy stored in chemical bonds, these red arrows, is that none of the red arrows go back and recycle to the producers. So the energy that is created by producers and passed on to organisms in the ecosystem, it eventually is used up. However, the other thing they want to focus on here is the chemical bonds or the nutrients, the blue arrows. They get taken up by the producers, and you'll see that they go to the other organisms in the ecosystem, and they do eventually make their way back. So they are, you can see the blue arrows. There is a recycling factor here, and whether we're talking about from here to here, or from here to here, they do come, the nutrients do eventually come back to build the bodies of the producers, and then are eaten by the producers, or broken down and brought back to the producers again. So let's talk a little bit more about these producers. Producers produce, I like that, they produce their own energy. So they do this through photosynthesis. What's created are sugars, and then sugars can go into other metabolic pathways to make things like complex carbohydrates or complex sugars, other carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and the variety of other kinds of foods out there. So very simply, the producers take carbon dioxide from the air, energy that's captured from sunlight, water taken in from the ground. The three of these abiotic factors go into the process of photosynthesis in a producer, and it releases oxygen and makes sugar, but also other types of molecules and compounds that we eat. Also helps the producers to grow themselves. The producers on Earth are plants, algae, cyanobacteria. We also call the producers autotrophs. Auto means self, troph means feed. So it means that they feed themselves. Now I know you and I, we are big, we can feed ourselves, but that's not what it means. It means they can feed themselves through the chemical reactions that are done in their body through the process of photosynthesis. So they truly can feed the cells in their body. Autotroph, self-feeder. The thing that they do is they will utilize the energy to build the rest of their body, but then they will make energy in the form of, if we're talking about plants, for example, plants, like if you have a tomato plant continues to grow and uses some of the energy captured from the sun, water, carbon dioxide to build its body, but it also makes food available in the form of tomatoes. Now you don't eat the complete tomato plant, but you eat the tomatoes that grow on there, so you eat that fruit. So they make that available to other organisms. Consumers are organisms that take in the energy from producers. So they consume their energy. These organisms are also called heterotrophs. Hetero means other, troph means feeder. It means they get their energy from some other source than their own body or cells. They cannot make their own energy, so they get it somewhere other than themselves. Let's talk about the idea of primary productivity. Primary productivity is the amount of life an ecosystem can support depending on how much energy can be captured by the producers. So how much energy the producers can make available to everybody else will depend on how well everybody else does in the ecosystem. Primary productivity, how productive the primary producers can be. Net primary productivity is everything that's available to everything else in the ecosystem after the primary producers build their own body. So it's one thing to think about is that the light, carbon dioxide, and water, all that is taken into a plant, is not directly made available to every other organism. They do have to grow their own body. So some of that goes into the body of the tomato plant, and the tomato plant then thus makes just the tomatoes available to everybody else. So net primary productivity has to subtract all of this, and it really is only those fruits and veggies and other products that are available to other organisms. So primary productivity, it'll depend on a bunch of other factors that are nutrient availability, how rich your air, water, soil is, because you have to get those nitrogens, carbons, oxygens, hydrogens from somewhere. The amount of sunlight. They need sunlight. It's critical to photosynthesis. How much water is available, another thing that is necessary for photosynthesis. If you have a nice temperature to work at. If it's really, really cold, one of the principles that we know about the movement of molecules is that molecules slow down in colder temperatures, and they go faster in warmer temperatures. So warmer temperatures, not too warm, but nice warm temperatures help productivity to go up. If we look at just some of the different ecosystems in the world, we can compare just, average net primary productivity. This is in grams of organic material per square meter per year, but let's just look at the numbers and see which numbers are big and which are small, and we can kind of tell which ones are more productive and why. So the tropical rainforest, it has a number of 2,200, very productive, nice, warm, sunny, highly available water and nutrients there, and so they have a really high productivity level. If we look at a place like where we live, for example, like the temperate deciduous forest or the grassland, the prairie, we can see those numbers are about half to less than what the tropical rainforest is here. That's because we have winter, where the water availability goes way down and our sunlight goes way down. And so that things move a lot slower, we have a lot less warmth and less sunlight. So our productivity goes down. If you look at the desert here, the desert, even though it has a lot of sunlight and warm temperatures, and it may have a lot of nutrients, it does not have a lot of water. So that really slows down or lowers its productivity. So you can see just the differences between productivity and why, based on these 4 factors, they may be different. Energy flows from one, what we call trophic level, remember autotrophs, heterotrophs, from one trophic or feeding level to another. The first trophic level are called the primary producers, and those are the ones that produce their own energy, the autotrophs. So for example, we might be talking about like grass, plants, algae, cyanobacteria. The second trophic level are the primary consumers, and they eat, this level eats this level. And so we're talking about, like, if we were framing that in terms of humans, we would talk about like a vegetarian or a vegan. We also call them herbivores in biology. The third trophic level is our secondary consumers, and they eat both the secondary trophic level and the first trophic level. So they eat some plants, but they also eat some animals. And when you eat a variety of different kinds of organisms from different trophic levels, we call that an omnivore. Partially carnivore if you eat some animals. The fourth trophic level, the tertiary consumers, these are carnivores that eat secondary consumers and primary consumers, and they might eat some primary producers. They might get a little bit of plant material. And so we might classify them as carnivores or omnivores because they eat maybe a variety of the 3 levels below them, or they may focus on just the 2 levels below them and be a carnivore. These we often call apex predators. Apex is the tip or the top. So these are the top predators in our ecosystem. So here you can see, first level, the primary producers. Here we have the primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. So if you are an organism who is here, you primarily eat here. If you are an organism here, you primarily eat here and here. And if you're up here, you primarily may eat a little bit of everything. You may focus on just these two. One of the things that I want to point out in this diagram is the arrow. The arrow points to where the energy flows. So here we can see the energy here is transferred or flows from the primary producers to the primary consumers. Energy here flows to the primary consumers and secondary consumers, and the energy here still flows upward. Kind of makes sense, right? Because if you think about like a rabbit, this arrow is not saying the rabbit eats the snake. It's saying the energy of the rabbit flows into the snake when the snake eats the rabbit. Based on the second law of thermodynamics, we also have an issue of energy transfer. When energy is transferred from one form into another, the amount of usable energy goes down because at every transfer, energy gets lost as heat. And what you may also notice is that these arrows are bigger. The heat energy arrows are actually bigger than the transfer energy between the trophic levels. So let's answer this question. If a wolf eats a rodent that ate a smaller insect that ate a plant, the wolf would be what? So let's start at the plant. If the plant is an autotroph or primary producer, the plant would be A and B. That insect would be a primary consumer. The rodent would be a secondary consumer, and the wolf would be the tertiary consumer. So E is correct. And again, you can see here, if we're looking at the flow of energy on land, we might have a leaf that gets eaten by a caterpillar. Again, the arrow shows where the energy flows. Energy from the leaf flows to the caterpillar. Energy from the caterpillar flows to this bird. This smaller bird, the energy flows to this larger bird. We can see this in the ocean too. Phytoplankton, or small autotrophs in the ocean, primary producers. The energy flows to what we call zooplankton. The zooplankton get eaten by small fish. Energy flows to the small fish. And the small fish, the energy flows to a larger fish like a shark. Now, is this really illustrative of what happens in the real world? Maybe not, because if you look at like the top, for example, does this type of bird only eat that type of caterpillar, and does that type of bird only eat that type of bird? Does this shark only eat this species of fish? Probably not. We probably eat more of a variety of things. So when we're taking a look at energy flow, one of the things that we don't see is that we often don't see omnivores in these illustrations like you saw before. So let's talk about what is more expletive of organisms in an ecosystem, which is a food web. So a food web, it's more proper because it shows that most organisms eat more than one kind of thing. So this is a little more detailed. You do see a lot of arrows going around. And again, you can see like this mouse here, for example. This mouse may get eaten by an owl, a badger, a snake, or a hawk. And it shows that also the snake might also eat a mouse, but it might eat a chipmunk too. So we have a lot of variety here of what everything can eat. And again, we're remembering that the arrows show where the energy flows, right? The mouse is not going to eat this owl. The mouse is not going to eat the badger, but the energy from the mouse flows to the badger or flows to the owl. A lot of times when we're looking at food webs, a lot of focus is on the autotrophs or the producers as the base of the food web, but maybe there's others that are kind of the base of the food web. And so let's talk about some other important members who may often get forgotten, which are the detritivores and the decomposers. They're really important because they give the nutrients, carbons, nitrogens, hydrogens, oxygens, all of the atoms back to the producers so that the producers can make food available to the system. So let's not forget about these two really important groups. A little bit about detritivores. So detritivores, they consume things like fallen leaves, they consume dead organisms, they consume the waste of other organisms, and then other things that are just kind of in an ecosystem. Some examples are like turkey vultures, we see them in our area. They will eat dead things. Earthworms, millipedes, insects, other worms, or other scavengers. So these organisms, they can take the energy that they need from those dead things, and then they make the nutrients available back to the system. So they're really important. So here's an example, the dung beetle.
And a lot more. They can shift up to 200 times their weight in feces every day. A fresh dropping is cleaned up within 3 minutes. Spread everywhere by the lowly beetles, the nitrogen-rich dung fertilizes the grasslands, helping to sustain millions of animals, and in turn, the entire food chain.
Here are true facts about the dung beetle. The dung beetle survives mainly or solely by eating the faces of other animals. It's terrifying. Wait, that's a typo. It eats the feces of other animals. That's even worse. The rolling dung beetle finds dung with its acute sense of smell. The dung beetle then selects a choice piece to roll into a bowl. That's disgusting. Cut it. Cut the clip. I told you I'm not going to narrate the footage of poop. It's just not going to happen. This isn't better. This has nothing to do with the dung beetle. Fine. The female dung beetles then judge their potential mates by the size of their balls. Oh, come on, that's a lynx. Wait, why is he stalking that Santa baby? Run away, Santa baby. After a mating pair is established, the female often attaches herself to the dung ball chariot, and the male rolls them away from the dung pile. He does this backwards by pushing on the ball with his hind legs. Imagine getting into a car and putting your head face down on the seat, and then steering with your butt. That is how the dung beetle do. Needless to say, they get lost from time to time. When it strays off course, the dung beetle climbs on top of its ball and uses the position of the sun, the moon, and even the Milky Way to reorient itself. Sort of like how ancient sailors once did. Except without the giant ball of shit. Here, a scientist uses a mirror to confuse the hell out of a dung beetle. Along the way, he must face challengers who seek to claim his turd ball, the ensuing battle sometimes lasting for hours. When they have finally completed their journey, the young freaky couple digs a small hole in the soft sand. The female then lays her eggs inside the dung ball and then seals them up, using more dung, her saliva, and her own feces, just for good measure. And then when the baby is born, it eats its way out. The circle of life. Just remember, no matter how bad your job is, even if you shovel crap for a living, at least you're not doing it naked, and with your mouth, and then eating it.
The beetles are nature's god.
All right, so just a nice fun video about how some of the nutrients are recycled. We also have the decomposers. I like to call these two groups, the detritivores and decomposers, the D and Ds, or the base of the food web. Decomposers, they feed off of, again, waste of the detritus. So imagine eating the waste of something that feeds on dead things and waste. Gross. But also they eat dead organisms, not any better. They also break down what they're eating, take out the energy for themselves, recycle the nutrients for the autotrophs or the primary producers. Bacteria are a big group. Not all bacteria do this, but there are bacterial groups, and then there are fungi groups. The fungi are really interesting because they will do their digestion outside of their body, and then they will bring the nutrients and energy inside. We digest inside our body, so very different. Let's answer this question then. Without decomposers and detritus feeders in an ecosystem, which of these would be true? So would the plants eventually die? Yes, because the plants would soon develop nutrient deficiencies. So good thing I kept reading. Dead material would accumulate. Yeah, nobody would be able to break it down. Soil quality would get poorer because no one would be able to recycle the nutrients from the bodies of the dead organisms and the waste. So correct answer is all of these. Don't forget, when you're looking at questions, don't just stop at the first one. Make sure you read on. It's good practice in case there's something like this. So a little tip there. Energy transfer in general is very inefficient because of the laws of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics, again, says that a lot of usable energy is lost as heat. Also, some energy is lost because organisms have to take some into their own bodies to grow themselves. Cellulose, or what we would know as fiber, is very indigestible by a lot of organisms, so it gets locked in the very tight bonds. And then consumers need to also build their bodies, so there isn't a lot that's passed on there as well. We have to fuel our everyday activities and build our own cells. So this is kind of a nice illustration because you can see the amount of energy that the producers get. Okay, so they get energy. They're going to pass some of that energy on to the D&Ds, the decomposers, and the detritivores when they die. Look at how little energy is passed on through the trophic levels. From the primary consumers, secondary consumers, look at the size of these arrows, even in comparison to the amount of energy that is passed on to the D&Ds. And even bigger than this arrow here, or these arrows passing here or here, you've got energy lost as heat at every level. So this should tell you that when we're talking about the energy, the net primary productivity or energy that can be passed on, the majority of it is getting lost as heat. So energy pyramids, the energy transfer from one trophic level to the next is only about 10% efficient. So 10% efficient means 90% inefficient. 90% of the energy is either utilized in the organisms or lost as heat. Herbivores are only going to be able to pass on 10%, carnivores 10%. This is what we would call the 10% law. So here, if they absorb 100% energy to start with, they utilize some of it in their own bodies, and passing from one level to the next, let's say only 10% is passed on, The primary consumers can only pass on, of that original 100%, 1% goes to the secondary consumers, 0.1 to the tertiary consumers, and if we have even higher level consumers, quaternary, they only get 0.01%. So that is tiny. And this can just visually show you too. If we have, let's say, 1,000 calories is produced here, only 100 is passed on to the primary consumer, 10 to the secondary consumer, and 1 to the tertiary consumer. So that is why we're going to see a lot more here, because they are more efficient at utilizing energy. So a lot more plants, algae, cyanobacteria, a lot more producers or autotrophs are in ecosystems. It's also why you don't get as many predators up here, is that the amount of energy that's available all the way up is very, very small. So we definitely see less and less organisms as you go up, and that's why it forms that pyramid shape. Another issue in ecosystems are toxic substances. When a toxic substance is passed through an ecosystem, it is often called biological magnification, sometimes biomagnification, sometimes it's called biological amplification or bioamplification. The amount of toxin that is absorbed by the primary producers, it all gets passed on to the primary consumers. What the primary consumers also accumulate in their lifetime, in addition to what they got from the primary producers, that all goes up to the secondary consumers. Secondary consumers take all of those toxins in addition to what they absorb, and they pass it on to what eats them. So it magnifies, or it gets worse and worse the higher up you eat in the trophic levels. So one of the things that happens is, we know this in the past, studies on DDT, for example, that where DDT was used to control things like mice and other household pets, that people became very sick. One of the stabilizing structures in a lot of these toxic substances is that there's a chlorine, and when chlorine binds into these substances, it makes them very difficult to break down. It makes them what we call non-biodegradable or stable. So with certain atoms within a molecular compound, they become very, very stable and hard to break down by living things. It makes them, like I said, non-biodegradable. So by definition, biodegradable means that a living thing can break down this substance. Non-biodegradable means it cannot be broken down. So it stays and gets recycled in the ecosystem, or gets passed from one trophic level to the next, to the next, to the next. These substances are usually not water soluble, so meaning that we can't, for example, release them in our sweat or in our urine or breathe them out. We store them in our fat, so that when one organism eats another one, it gets stored in their fat. And when then they get eaten, it gets taken in and passed on to the next level, because the fat makes something taste better, for example. So the more, if you're eating really high up in the trophic levels, like you're an apex predator and you're eating a lot of organisms below you, and the higher up that you eat, let's say that you're a shark and you just eat big fish, well, you're getting all the accumulation of everything below that fish that you eat. So you're getting lots and lots of toxins. So it's another reason why, as we go up, we have less and less of the predators up at the top. If we think about that in terms of humans, the higher you eat in the trophic levels, so if you eat a lot of meat, you're getting a lot of these toxins in your diet too. Whereas if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, you're not getting as much. If we looked at predatory birds, for example, there might be a little bit of toxin in the water, the highest level bird or the apex bird in that ecosystem might have 1,000,000 times the concentration of the toxin in that water. That's a lot. That's really damaging. What can happen is that those predators at the top can be so few that it can destroy the entire community, and we'll get into keystone species as well. And remember, again, the more meat you eat, higher up you eat in the trophic levels, you're not immune to this issue either. So here you can see, just visually, if there's 2 parts per million of some toxin in the water, the primary producers get 5 parts per million in their body. This fish who eats a whole bunch of these will have 200 parts per million of that toxin in their body. And this bird up here who eats a bunch of them and a bunch of them, it's going to have 1,600 parts per million in its body. So it definitely magnifies or accumulates. You can see that biomagnification as you go up. So one thing I want you all to think about is this an interesting concept. More people can be fed with grain than with meat. I want you to think about what this means.